Have you ever picked up a passenger who didn't exist? I thought I was just an ordinary taxi driver, but one ride changed my life forever. A booking that wasn't in the system, a person no one remembers, and a truth I should never have learned. But the scariest part came after. If you watch this video until the end, you'll never want to take a taxi at night again. I was a taxi driver, and I picked up a man who disappeared right in front of my eyes. I had been driving a taxi for 3 years. I had seen it all: drunk passengers, crime disputes, people who clearly had nothing to lose. But no story compares to that one night that turned my life upside down. It was late at night, and my shift was nearing its end. I was about to close the app when a new booking came in. The address was strange, a remote, desolate part of town, almost abandoned. Hardly anyone called for a taxi from there. I arrived, silence all around. Darkness. In the beam of my headlights, I saw an old, decrepit house with boarded-up windows. I was about to cancel the ride when suddenly a man emerged from the shadows. He was tall, thin, wearing a long black coat. In the faint light, his face was barely visible. He silently got into the back seat. "Take me to Central Street," he said quietly. His voice, it was muffled, as if he were speaking through thick glass. He carried with him a damp, cold air, even though the night outside was warm. I glanced at him through the rearview mirror and felt chills run down my spine. I couldn't see his face. It was blurry, as if I were looking at a poorly focused camera image. I swallowed, tried not to think about it, and started driving. We drove in silence. I turned on the radio, but it immediately began to hiss, as if the signal had been lost. "A lot of people have died here," he suddenly said. I flinched. "Sorry, what?" "Here, on this highway, every night someone dies." I felt a tightness in my chest. "Well, yeah, there are a lot of accidents here." "That's bad," he replied quietly. Something about his words made me uneasy. I looked in the mirror and noticed that the man was closer now, even though he hadn't moved. I sped up, wanting to finish the trip quickly. At one point, I noticed his hands, pale, almost white, with dark marks resembling burns. Finally, we arrived at an intersection. "Here," he said. I stopped. He reached for the door handle and vanished. He simply disappeared the moment I blinked. I jumped out of the car. The street was empty, not a soul in sight. But when I looked back, there were marks on the back seat, wet, dirty stains, as if someone had sat there in damp clothes. I grabbed my phone and checked the app. There was no record of the booking. My trip history showed my last ride was 2 hours earlier. I was convinced I was losing my mind, but the scariest part came next. The next day, I went back to work as usual. Everything seemed normal, until I got a new request. It was from the same address. I declined immediately, but the request came again, and again, 4 times in a row. I decided to drive there during the day. When I arrived, the house looked even more dilapidated. I got out and looked around. Something felt wrong about the place. The door to the house was slightly ajar. Inside, it smelled of dampness and ash. Scattered on the floor were old, burnt photographs. I picked one up. It was of a family, a man, a woman, and a small child. But the most frightening thing, that man looked exactly like my passenger. My heart stopped. I looked around and then noticed a large mirror on the wall. It was covered in soot, but through the grime I saw my reflection. But I wasn't alone. Behind me he stood. And this time I saw his face, charred skin, torn lips, eyes black as coal. I turned around. There was no one behind me, but in the mirror he was still there. He was staring straight at me. I bolted out, got into my car and drove off, not caring where I was going. I haven't driven a taxi since. But the story didn't end there. 3 months passed. I had almost forgotten that nightmare. But one day, as I stepped out of my house, I noticed something strange on my car hood. A charred photograph of that family, and my car in the background. But that photograph had been taken 5 years ago, on the very day that man had burned to death. And now I know he's waiting for me to drive again.